wanted to talk briefly about spheres of influence because very few people understand them, but people use the term all the time. And I've done academic research about this. This has been like my contribution to debates about international order, was conceptualizing spheres of influence, how they work, how they're contested, et cetera, et cetera. And it, of course, has import in the context of like Sino-US international competition. And it was all triggered by a piece I saw in the Boston Review a few days ago, a week ago, I don't know. The piece itself is like a reprint from a piece last year during like the height of the pandemic, but by this guy in Guam named Julian Aguan, and he talks about, in very poetic terms, it's like a very poignant essay to read, but he talks about how the Pentagon has been for like well over a decade at this point, gradually trying to relocate 5,000 U.S. Marines from Okinawa in Japan, where the presence causes serious political problems for the Japanese, to Guam, which is a U.S. territory, but not a U.S. state, and not an independent nation. And the relocating those forces requires building a series of live fire training bases in Guam. And to do that, they have to basically level large amounts of forestry and public land. Anytime you have to build a military base anywhere, it's going to be a blight on the environment, right? It's just the nature of the beast. And so Julian's writing this piece that's bringing the sentimentality and injustice of what's happening home. And it's like, okay, you're exploiting the fact that Guam is not an independent nation to like appease one of your allies where troop presence creates political problems. But you can make the Guamanians, the Chamorros, eat political problems because you control them. And so, he talks about in the piece about so much protests and domestic political resentment about this series of construction of military bases and the leveling of forests and stuff, but like they can't do anything about it. All they can do is protest about it because they don't have sovereignty and they're not a state with representation that a state would. Like they're not in the federal system the way other territories are in the United States. And he had this, all of course is justified ultimately on the back of competition with China. And there's a nuclear bomber base in Guam that, again, it's not that the people have chosen this, it's that the United States chose to put it there. And it makes Guam itself a target of nuclear armed missiles in scenarios of conflict with China and especially with North Korea. In the nuclear crisis with North Korea in 2017, there were maps that Kim Jong-un unfurled showing the trajectory of missiles hitting Guam among other places. And the only reason it was trying to hit Guam was because of the nuclear bomber base. And so, like, can you think of something more fair than like nuclear destruction without representation, And that's what we're talking about. And so the piece, the bottom line was, he had this amazing one-liner where he says, "No military on earth is sensitive enough to perceive something as soft as the whisper of another worldview." And that's the indictment of militarism, like in a nutshell, right? But then on top of that, like the reason why this matters, like I said about the Sino-US competition, Guam is part of an American sphere of influence. We don't think of America as having a sphere of influence in the pernicious sense. And this is why it matters that there's like an academic concept underlying this. People hear the word influence and they think like, well, powerful people are influential. Like if you're powerful, you're going to have influence. What's wrong with that? Or like, that's inevitable, right? No. Like that's the colloquial understanding of influence, of spheres of influence. The conceptual analytical understanding is that spheres of influence are forms of relationships, relational order that are constructed out of practices of control and exclusion. Okay. And this is why it gets confusing, because anywhere you find in international relations practices of control and exclusion, you have a sphere of influence where a foreign power is exclusionarily controlling the foreign policies of another state. a local state, and other states are recognizing that. That's spheres of influence. And that's compatible with various forms of hegemony. That's compatible with balance of power orders. That's compatible with empires. It's most common with empires, in fact, which is why you get a conflation of like spheres of influence and empires. But these are two different kinds of things. So you can find spheres of influences in lots of places, which is why even while America is not an empire per se, it has a sphere of influence because it in the Pacific, because it controls, literally, formally, officially controls, to the exclusion of all others, Palau's foreign policy, the Federated States of Micronesia's foreign policy, the Marshall Islands foreign policy, Guam's foreign policy, and it has less formal control over other places. Where it does not have a sphere of influence is like Japan, South Korea, right? Because these are countries where they conduct their own foreign policies, for one, but America's influence there is not exclusionary. There's lots of sources of influence over those countries' foreign policy, right? Including domestic constituencies. So this is not an argument that America is an empire. And it's not an argument that every place where America has bases is part of its sphere of influence. All of that stuff is caricature. But there is a bona fide, for real, unquestionable sphere of influence that's American in the Pacific. And most American policymakers are not even aware of it. Nobody talks about it. Analytically, it's not folded into any arguments. And it's an extension of the fact that America has military primacy, untrammeled primacy in the Pacific. And one of the things that's happening now is that China's political expansion, its expansion of influence into the Pacific, this is happening in a context, in a space where America still has military primacy. So you're having this where I think maybe we've talked about it on the show, but like the dual hierarchical order of Asia, where it's like you have America as hegemon in the security realm in Asia, you have China as the hegemon of the economic realm in Asia, and the regional order for the past generation has been this uneasy dual hierarchy, where it's like for the first time in history, you have not a hegemonic order, but a dual hegemonic order, right? And then individual states have to navigate that. And that's how you get hedging, right? Because it's like when you're having to obey, in a simplification, but you're having to like obey two hegemons at the same time. And the only thing that makes it works is that these hegemons are functionally differentiated. These hegemonies are functionally differentiated, right? Economic versus security. Well, in the Pacific, that's converging, right? And maybe not just in the Pacific, but for sure. Because there's China has no realistic way of challenging American military might in this area. But what good is the military might if China can subvert the entire thing and flip it politically to be its own geopolitical sphere of influence, you know? So there really is a clash here. And it's kind of orthogonal to these caricatured notions of Sinocentric order or Chinese hegemony seeking versus, American defense of liberal international order. If that's your narrative of what's happening in Asia, then of course you're not really aware of how this dynamic is playing out in the Pacific. And so all of this was brought to the fore by this piece on Guam, but it underscores the only reason this is happening in the first place is because we're having contested, basically, spheres of influence.